I am Joshua, 28, and my own mother just coldly banned me from my younger brother's wedding over the phone. Before I tell you about how I completely dismantled their perfect, fraudulent lives at that very reception, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The water from the kitchen sink was running cold over my hands, but I barely felt it. It was a Tuesday evening in my cramped, one-bedroom apartment. The kind of apartment where the heater constantly rattled and the windows let in the winter draft. I had just spent the last 3 weeks working late into the night after my regular shifts, meticulously designing the perfect custom wedding invitations for my younger brother, Matthew. I'm a graphic designer, and even though my salary was barely enough to keep the lights on and my rent paid, I had paid for the premium sample prints out of my own pocket. I wanted to give them something beautiful. I wanted to show my family that I cared, that I had value, that I belonged. I dried my hands on a cheap towel and picked up my phone, dialing my mother's number. I put her on speaker and set the phone on the chipped Formica counter. "Hey, Mom," I answered, trying to keep my voice light and cheerful. "I finally have the invitation proofs ready to drop off." The gold foil came out looking absolutely incredible. There was a pause on the line. Then, a heavy, exhausted sigh. It was the exact same sigh she used when I was 10 and asked for help with my math homework, or when I was 18 and asked if they could come to my high school graduation. It was the sound of someone burdened by my mere existence. "Joshua, don't bother with the invitations," my mother, Sarah, said. Her voice was flat, clipped, and devoid of any maternal warmth. "We went with a professional printer in the city, a highly recommended stationer." I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white. I was a professional. I had a degree, but I swallowed the hard lump of pride in my throat, just like I had been conditioned to do my entire life. "Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. I haven't gotten my official invitation in the mail yet anyway. Did they get lost in the post? I can just RSVP directly to you right now." The silence that followed didn't just stretch. It suffocated the room. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background at her house. "Joshua, I think we need to be honest with each other," she finally said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. We all agreed. "You're not welcome at the wedding." I froze. My breath caught in my chest. I stared at the digital clock on the microwave, watching the numbers blur. "What do you mean we all agreed? Who is we?" "Your father, Matthew, Chloe, her parents. We all sat down and discussed it. We think it's for the best. You always make everything about you, Joshua. You're constantly seeking attention. Matthew deserves to have his special day be absolutely perfect, without you causing a scene or bringing down the mood." My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. When had I ever made anything about me? I was the ghost of the Morgan family. I showed up to every holiday, sat in the corner, ate my food quietly, and clapped for their achievements. "Mom, he's my brother," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking, betraying the immense pain fracturing my chest. "And I'm your mother," she snapped back, her tone suddenly vicious. "Respect our decision. Do not show up." Click. The line went dead. I stood there in the quiet humming of my refrigerator, feeling a piece of my soul just snap off and die. I didn't cry. I think I was too hollowed out to cry. Looking back, I shouldn't have been surprised. I walked over to the small corkboard by my desk where I kept a few family photos, the only meager evidence I had that I belonged to a family. I stared at them, really looked at them for the first time without making excuses for my parents' behavior. My eyes landed on a photo from Matthew's promotion party last year. Matthew stood in the dead center, raising a crystal glass of champagne, flashing his perfectly straight, orthodontist-crafted teeth. My dad, Joseph, had his arm proudly draped around Matthew's shoulder, his chest puffed out. My mom was beaming at him like he was the second coming. And me? I was shoved to the far left edge of the frame, half cut out of the picture, holding a stack of dirty paper plates and a trash bag, caught mid-stride on my way to the kitchen to clean up their mess. That was the story of my life. I was the hired help they didn't have to pay. I was the shadow. Growing up, I always wondered what was inherently wrong with me. Was I unlovable? Was I just born a disappointment? When I brought home a B+ on my high school report card, Joseph crossed his arms, glared at me, and told me I needed to apply myself or I'd end up a failure. When Matthew brought home a C-, Joseph patted his back, took him out for ice cream, and said the teacher was obviously biased. I worked 2 grueling jobs in my early 20s to pay my own rent and student loans. Matthew got his luxury downtown loft paid for by my parents because his real estate job was high stress, and he needed a prestigious place to entertain clients. I always foolishly believed that if I just worked harder, smiled brighter, and asked for less, they would finally look at me the way they looked at him. But standing in my kitchen, officially exiled from the biggest event in our family's history, the bitter, jagged truth washed over me. You cannot earn the love of people who have already decided you are worthless. I needed a distraction before the walls of my apartment crushed me. I remembered my Grandma Mary had called me a few days ago, asking me to come help her clear out her massive, dusty attic before she downsized to an assisted living facility. My parents, of course, were too busy with wedding preparations to help their own mother. I grabbed my keys and drove over to her old Victorian house on Saturday morning. The attic smelled like decades of trapped dust, old pine wood, and mothballs. I spent 4 hours hauling heavy boxes of old clothes, broken lamps, and forgotten holiday decorations down the narrow, creaking stairs. My muscles ached, but the physical labor was the only thing keeping my mind from spiraling. Around noon, I was shoving some empty cardboard boxes into a dark, recessed corner under the eaves when my heavy work boot hit something solid. It didn't sound like cardboard. It sounded like heavy wood. I knelt down, coughing through the dust, and pulled away a moth-eaten canvas tarp. Hidden completely out of sight was a heavy, antique wooden trunk. It was bound in iron and secured with a heavy brass padlock. I don't know why, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart started pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't a box of old winter coats. This was hidden intentionally. I looked around the dimly lit space and saw an old, rusted Folgers coffee can sitting on a nearby shelf, filled with assorted keys. I sat cross-legged on the floorboards and began trying them, one by one. It took me nearly 20 minutes, my frustration mounting, until a small, ornate brass key finally slid in and turned with a satisfying heavy click. I threw the heavy wooden lid open. Inside, it wasn't old clothes. It was a treasure trove of secrets. There were stacks of legal documents, a bundle of letters tied with brittle twine, and resting at the very bottom was a heavy, leather-bound photo album. Embossed in gold lettering on the cover were the words, "Family Secrets Unspoken," in my grandmother's looping handwriting. I pulled the album into my lap and opened the heavy cover. What I saw on the very first page made all the blood drain from my face, leaving me dizzy and breathless. Before I tell you what was in that album, you have to truly understand the sickening level of favoritism I lived with every single day of my life. As I turned the thick pages of the album, a loose photo slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up. It was a picture of Matthew on his 16th birthday. I remember that day with crystal clarity. We had all walked out to the driveway, and there it was, gleaming in the morning sun. A brand new silver Porsche 911. It had a giant, absurd red bow stuck to the roof. Matthew had screamed, jumping up and down, hugging my parents. My dad tossed him the keys with a proud smirk, like buying a luxury sports car was just a casual Tuesday event. A Porsche, for a 16-year-old kid. 2 years prior to that, on my 16th birthday, Joseph had called me into the kitchen, handed me a single greasy key on a plain metal ring, and pointed out the window to the street. Parked on the curb was a rusted, faded blue sedan with a massive dent in the passenger door, a cracked windshield, and 150,000 miles on the dashboard. It shook violently when it idled and smelled like stale cigarette smoke. "Builds character, Joshua?" my dad had said, crossing his arms and looking at me with mild distaste. "You have to learn the value of a hard-earned dollar. Nothing in this life is free." I had thanked him profusely. I drove that dangerous, unreliable rust bucket for 6 years through college. I never once complained. But looking at the photo of Matthew leaning confidently against his Porsche, a sick, churning feeling twisted in my gut. How did my parents even afford a Porsche? Joseph was a mid-level regional manager, and my mom hadn't worked a day in her life. I had always assumed they just saved up every penny they had for Matthew because they loved him more. I looked back down at the album resting in my lap. The dust motes danced in the single beam of sunlight piercing the attic window. I was about to find out exactly how they afforded it. I turned back to the first page of the album. The photos were of my mother, Sarah. She looked young, vibrant, maybe in her early 20s. She was laughing, her head thrown back. But the man holding her, kissing her cheek, wrapping his strong arms possessively around her waist, was not Joseph. He was a tall, striking man with jet black hair, sharp, aristocratic features, and intense dark eyes. I stared at his face. I traced his strong jawline with my trembling index finger. I looked at the shape of his eyes, the curve of his brow. The attic spun around me. My stomach plummeted into a bottomless abyss. I was looking at a mirror. He looked exactly like me. I flipped the pages frantically, tearing at the old paper. There were dozens of pictures of them together. Vacations, fancy dinners, quiet moments on a beach. They looked happy, deeply, passionately in love. Then, abruptly, the photos stopped. I reached with shaking hands for the bundle of letters tied with twine. I pulled out the top envelope. The paper was crisp and yellowed with age. I slipped the letter out and began to read. It was addressed to Sarah. I scanned the elegant, confident handwriting. I am willing to provide full financial support for the child. The Morgan family name will be used to protect reputations and avoid scandal. Joseph's cooperation is appreciated. This agreement is strictly contingent on absolute silence. I stopped breathing. The air in the attic felt thick and heavy. The Morgan family name. That was my name. I looked at the date scrawled at the top of the letter. It was exactly 5 months before I was born. Joseph wasn't my father. My entire life, my entire identity, the reason I had always felt like an outsider looking in through a dirty window. It was all making a horrifying, sickening kind of sense. I wasn't the black sheep of the family. I was a secret. I was a mistake they had been paid handsomely to hide. I didn't bother packing up the rest of the boxes. I grabbed the album and the letters, my hands gripping them so tightly my knuckles ached, and marched toward the attic stairs. The wooden steps groaned in protest under my heavy boots as I descended. Grandma Mary was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made tea. She turned around with a warm, wrinkly smile, but it vanished the absolute second she saw what was in my hands. The porcelain teacup rattled violently against the saucer as she practically dropped it onto the counter. Where did you get that?" she whispered, all the color draining from her face, leaving her looking fragile and terrified. I slammed the heavy leather album down on the kitchen table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet house. "Who is he, Grandma? Who is this man? And why do I look exactly like him?" She slumped into a wooden kitchen chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. She started to cry, weak, shuddering sobs that shook her frail shoulders. "You were never, ever supposed to find that, Joshua. Sarah made me hide it. She swore she'd cut me off if I ever told you. Tell me the truth," I demanded, planting my hands on the table, leaning over her. My voice was harder, colder than it had ever been in my entire life. "Is Joseph my father?" She shook her head slowly, looking up at me with red, watery eyes filled with decades of guilt. "No, your real father is Lincoln Reed. He's a very wealthy man, a billionaire real estate developer now. Your mother had a passionate affair with him before she married Joseph. When she got pregnant, Lincoln's family didn't want a scandal with a woman of her status. They made a deal. Joseph had always loved your mother. He agreed to marry her quickly and raise you as his own to save her reputation. In return, the Reeds provided substantial financial support." I felt nauseous. Bile rose in the back of my throat. So they were paid to tolerate me? That's why they look at me like a heavy burden. I'm just a walking paycheck to them. Joshua, please, she begged, reaching out with a frail hand to grab my wrist. Don't do anything rash. Don't ruin your brother's wedding over this. They kept a roof over your head. Let it go. Just let it go. I pulled my arm away violently, utterly disgusted. They already banned me from the wedding, Grandma. They threw me away like garbage. I have nothing left to ruin. I snatched the album off the table, turned on my heel, and walked out of her house, slamming the front door behind me. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I paced my small apartment like a caged animal. First thing Monday morning, I drove to a clinic and ordered a rush DNA test. I needed absolute, undeniable scientific proof before I tore my life apart. A few days later, the agonizing wait ended when the results hit my email inbox. 0% probability of paternity with Joseph Morgan. I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, reading those words over and over. I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Dylan. Dylan and I had been friends since college. He worked in IT, was fiercely loyal, and hated my family almost as much as I was starting to. He was at my door 20 minutes later, carrying a six-pack of cheap beer and his heavy laptop. If they were getting paid to raise you, Dylan said, cracking open a beer and handing it to me, his fingers flying across his keyboard, there has to be a paper trail. People don't just hand over envelopes of cash for 28 years. Do you know any of your mom's old passwords? I knew her go-to password. It was Matthew's birth date followed by the word golden. Disgusting, but incredibly useful right now. Dylan typed it into her main email provider. We held our breath as the loading screen spun. We were in. We started searching for keywords. Read, support, funds, transfer. Suddenly, Dylan stopped scrolling. The color drained from his face. Oh my God, Joshua, look at this. He clicked on a long email chain with a high-end financial advisor at a major wealth management firm. It wasn't just monthly child support. It was a record of massive, staggering withdrawals. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the dense text, my heart hammering. They had taken out $50,000 to pay for Matthew's private college tuition. They took out $120,000 a few years ago. I checked the date. The date matched exactly to the month when Matthew was gifted that Porsche. And the most recent withdrawal? A wire transfer for $80,000 labeled explicitly, venue and catering Matthew's wedding. They didn't just hide your dad? Dylan said quietly, the horror evident in his voice. Joshua, they've been stealing your college fund to bankroll your brother's entire life. My blood boiled, felt like liquid fire in my veins. They didn't just reject me, they robbed me blind. They funded their precious golden child with the money meant for the son they threw in the garbage. Every struggle I had, every late-night shift, every time I couldn't afford groceries, they had hundreds of thousands of dollars of my money sitting in an account. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't confront my mother yet. She was a master manipulator. She would just lie, gaslight me, and destroy the evidence. I needed to go straight to the source. I needed to talk to Lincoln Reed. Finding his corporate email wasn't hard. The man owned half the commercial real estate in the state and was a prominent public figure. Writing the email, however, was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for 20 agonizing minutes. What do you say to the man who paid your mother to hide your existence? I decided to keep it strictly business, devoid of the raging emotions inside me. Mr. Reed, my name is Joshua Morgan. I am Sarah Morgan's son. I recently discovered an old photo album in my grandmother's attic and took a DNA test. I know beyond a doubt that you are my biological father. I also know about the financial arrangement you made with my mother. I am not looking for your money. I just want 10 minutes of your time to understand why you threw me away. I have attached the official DNA results. I clicked send. I stared at the screen, my chest tight, fully expecting my email to bounce back, be ignored, or intercepted by an assistant. Less than an hour later, my phone pinged violently on the desk. A reply from Lincoln Reed. Joshua, tomorrow at 2 p.m. The Oak Room downtown. Ask the hostess for my private table. That was it. No denial. No anger. No legal threats. Just a time and a place. I laid back on my cheap sofa and stared at the water stains on the ceiling. The storm was coming, and I was about to walk right into the dead center of it. The Oak Room was the kind of ultra-exclusive restaurant where the waiters wore pristine tuxedos, the lighting was dim and moody, and a glass of water probably cost $20. I wore my only suit, a cheap poly blend I bought for a funeral years ago, which felt like paper armor in a place dripping with such wealth. The hostess, sensing I didn't belong but seeing my determination, led me to a private, soundproofed room in the back. A man was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling city skyline. He turned around slowly as I walked in. It was utterly surreal. Seeing him in person, breathing the same air, was like looking at an older, sharper, incredibly wealthy version of myself. He had the same strong jaw, the same dark, piercing eyes, the same broad shoulders. Lincoln Reed stared at me. He didn't step forward to shake my hand. He didn't speak. He just stared, his chest rising and falling heavily under his custom-tailored suit. And then, right in front of me, this ruthless billionaire real estate mogul's eyes filled with bright, shining tears. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're real." I stood my ground, my defenses instantly rising. I crossed my arms. "Of course I'm real. I've been real for 28 years while you paid my parents a fortune to pretend I wasn't." Lincoln frowned deeply, the tears clearing as intense confusion took over his features. "What are you talking about? Paid them? The money?" I snapped, the anger finally breaking through. "The massive monthly support. The six-figure withdrawals for my brother's Porsche and his extravagant wedding. The deal you made to protect your pristine reputation." Lincoln stepped toward me, his face turning an ashen pale. "Joshua, look at me. I never paid your parents a single dime. 28 years ago, your mother called me crying. She told me she couldn't handle the pressure and she got an abortion. I believed her. I mourned you. I grieved for the child I thought I lost. I never knew you existed until I opened your email yesterday." The room started to spin violently, the mahogany walls blurred. But the letters, the emails we found. Grandma Mary said the Reeds paid for my silence. "Sit down," Lincoln commanded, his voice suddenly sharp, authoritative, and terrifyingly calm. "Show me everything you found. Right now." I pulled out my phone and pulled up the photos of the letters and the emails Dylan and I had screenshotted. Lincoln sat across from me and read them in absolute silence. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold, dangerous, and filled with a lethal fury. "Joshua," Lincoln said softly, his voice dangerously low, "if I didn't send this money, we need to find out exactly whose money your mother has been stealing." Lincoln didn't waste a single second. He pulled out his phone and immediately called his chief legal counsel, a brilliant bulldog of a lawyer named Luke. Luke arrived at the restaurant within 20 minutes, carrying a thick leather briefcase and a look of absolute, focused determination. For the next 2 grueling days, I sat in the corner of Lincoln's massive, glass-walled corporate office while Luke and his elite team of forensic accountants tore my family's financial history apart piece by piece. They traced hidden routing numbers, pulled decades-old tax records, and aggressively subpoenaed bank statements from multiple institutions. On Thursday afternoon, the sky outside dark with rain, Luke walked into Lincoln's office and dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the glass desk with a loud thud. "We found it," Luke said grimly. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and righteous anger. "Joshua, the money didn't come from Lincoln, and it certainly didn't come from Joseph." "Then who?" I asked, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Your grandfather, Howard Morgan," Luke explained, opening the file and pointing to a series of notarized documents. "Before he died when you were young, he found out about your true parentage. He knew Sarah and Joseph treated you poorly, and he wanted to protect you. He secretly set up a massive, ironclad trust fund solely in your name. It was your inheritance. Millions of dollars, meant to unlock fully when you turned 21 to pay for college and your future. I couldn't speak. I felt a tear hot on my cheek. Grandpa Howard had loved me. He had seen my pain and he had tried to protect me. But, Luke continued, his voice hardening into a snarl, Sarah and Joseph forged your signature on the release forms. They declared you mentally unfit and financially irresponsible in a fraudulent medical document, using a corrupt doctor friend of Joseph's to sign off on it. They legally assumed total control of the trust as your guardians. Lincoln stood up violently, slamming his fist onto the glass desk. The coffee cups rattled. They stole his inheritance. They stole my son's future. Every single penny of it, Luke confirmed, his eyes dark. The Porsche, the private college tuition, the luxury vacations to Europe, and now Matthew's massive society wedding. It's all being funded exclusively by Joshua's trust fund. They bled it almost completely dry. I felt like I was going to throw up. The sheer level of psychotic evil it took to look me in the eye, hand me the keys to a broken down, dangerous car, and tell me to learn the value of $1, while simultaneously buying my younger brother a luxury sports car with my own money. They had systematically destroyed my self-esteem, kept me trapped in poverty, and funded their golden child with my grandfather's love. Luke, Lincoln said, his voice terrifyingly calm now, draft the criminal fraud charges. I want everything ready to file. He turned to me, walking around the desk and placing a strong, grounding hand on my shoulder. Joshua, what do you want to do? I will follow your lead. I looked at the thick folder of evidence. I thought about my mother's cold voice on the phone, telling me I wasn't welcome at the wedding I was unknowingly paying for. I thought about the decades of being treated like dirt on their shoes. I want to go to a wedding, I said, my voice steady and cold. Before the wedding, Lincoln insisted I meet his family. My real family. He drove me to his sprawling, magnificent estate in the wealthy suburbs. I was terrified. Would they look at me like an intruder? A bastard child coming to steal their own inheritance? Couldn't have been more wrong. Lincoln's wife, Carolyn, opened the heavy oak door. She took one look at me, covered her mouth with both hands, and pulled me into a tight, incredibly warm hug. We have an extra seat at the dinner table, she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. Welcome home, Joshua. I met Julian, my older half-brother. He was athletic, sharp, and had the same dark eyes as Lincoln. He slapped my shoulder hard, grinning broadly. Dad wasn't kidding. You completely stole my face. Sitting in their elegant living room that night, drinking rich coffee and laughing at Julian's jokes, I felt a strange, alien sensation blooming in my chest. Took me a minute to recognize it. It was safety. I wasn't an outsider here. I wasn't a burden. I was blood. So, about this extravagant wedding tomorrow, Julian said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. How exactly are you getting in if you're officially banned by the Wicked Witch of the West? Lincoln smiled, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Arthur, the father of the bride, sits on the board of directors for my commercial real estate firm. He is a man obsessed with honor and reputation. He personally invited Carolyn and me last month. I called him this afternoon and told him we would be bringing a very special, very important +1. We spent the rest of the evening meticulously formulating the plan. Luke had prepared certified copies of the forged trust documents, the bank statements showing the stolen funds, the fraudulent medical records, and the DNA test. Everything was neatly, perfectly organized in a sleek black leather folder. Arthur is a man who values integrity above absolutely all else. Lincoln told me, his eyes locked on mine. He hates liars and he brutally destroys thieves. If he finds out his beloved daughter is marrying into a family of felons, and that his daughter's dream wedding was paid for with stolen money, he won't hesitate to end them. I went back to my apartment that night and looked at my cheap, polyblend suit hanging in the closet. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Lincoln. A master tailor is coming to your apartment at 8 a.m. You are a Reed now. You will look like one. I smiled. I finally took the box containing the family photos I had pulled from the corkboard and dropped it into the dumpster outside. I was entirely done with the Morgans. Tomorrow, I was burning their fragile, fraudulent house of cards to the ground. The vineyard venue was spectacular. Rolling green hills covered in perfectly manicured vines. A massive white tent adorned with thousands of imported roses and dripping crystal chandeliers. And a live string quartet playing softly in the background. It was easily a $100,000 affair. And it was all on my dime. I walked in flanking Lincoln and Carolyn, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that fit me perfectly and cost more than my car. I felt like a completely different person. I walked tall. My shoulders were back. I wasn't the ghost anymore. We bypassed the outdoor ceremony and went straight to the cocktail hour being held in the grand hall before the main reception. As we entered the opulent room, I scanned the crowd of wealthy, laughing guests. It didn't take long to spot her. My mother, Sarah, was wearing a ridiculous, sparkling designer gown. She was holding a flute of champagne, throwing her head back and laughing with Arthur, the bride's wealthy father. As she turned her head, her eyes swept across the room and locked onto mine. I swear to God, I saw her soul leave her body. Her fake, radiant smile vanished instantly. The champagne glass trembled violently in her hand, spilling expensive liquid onto the marble floor. She quickly excused herself from Arthur, her eyes darting around in absolute, naked panic. She marched straight toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the stone. When she got close, she grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my expensive sleeve. She practically dragged me toward the secluded hallway leading to the restrooms. I let her, mostly out of morbid amusement. She pushed me violently into the empty men's restroom and locked the heavy wooden door behind us. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her face contorted with a hideous rage I had never seen so plainly. "I explicitly told you on the phone that you were banned. You are not welcome here." I calmly, deliberately brushed her hand off my suit sleeve, smoothing the fabric. "It's a public venue, Sarah. And frankly, since I personally paid for it with my stolen inheritance, I figured I'd drop by and check the catering." Her eyes widened in terror for a fraction of a second, but she quickly masked it with pure, defensive venom. "You're insane. You are deeply unwell. Listen to me, Joshua. You are going to ruin Matthew's life. I will not let your pathetic jealousy destroy my family. If you turn around and leave right now, I will write you a check for $10,000. Take it and never contact us again." I actually laughed. A loud, genuine laugh that echoed off the bathroom tiles. Couldn't help it. 10,000? That's generous, Mom, considering you owe me about $3 million. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly as she reached into her clutch for her checkbook. "Take the money and get out." I leaned in close, looking down at the pathetic woman who had tormented me, starved me of affection, and robbed me for 28 years. "You don't have any money, Sarah. This lavish party is draining the very last drops of the trust you stole. You're broke. And tonight, everyone out there is going to know exactly what you are." I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and walked past her, leaving her hyperventilating against the porcelain sink. The main reception was in full swing. Hundreds of guests were seated at round tables, eating prime rib and drinking expensive wine. Lincoln, Carolyn, and I were seated at a prominent VIP table near the front, right next to Arthur and the bride's immediate family. My father, Joseph, stood up at the head table, looking red-faced and jovial. He tapped his silver spoon against his crystal glass. The massive room quieted down, all eyes turning to him. Family, friends, esteemed guests. Joseph began, his voice booming with fake warmth and pride. "Tonight, we celebrate my son, Matthew, a man of deep integrity, a man of honor. Raising him has been the greatest joy and privilege of my life. He represents the absolute best of the Morgan family." I felt Lincoln shift next to me. He picked up the heavy black leather folder from his lap. "And to Arthur and his lovely family," Joseph continued, raising his glass high in the air. "Thank you for joining our families together. To Matthew and Chloe." Before anyone could take a drink, Lincoln stood up. His imposing presence commanded the room instantly. "Excuse me, Joseph. May I say a few words?" Joseph froze, his glass hovering in the air. He recognized Lincoln. He knew exactly who he was, even if they hadn't seen each other in nearly 3 decades. All the color drained from Joseph's face, leaving him looking sickly gray. Mr. Reed, I didn't know you were here." "Arthur invited me," Lincoln said, his voice echoing perfectly, coldly through the quiet hall. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the front, holding the black folder. I stood up and followed him, standing right by his side, my head held high. Arthur looked confused, setting his glass down. "Lincoln, is everything all right?" "Arthur," Lincoln said, stopping right in front of the head table, staring Joseph down. "You value absolute honesty in business. I assume you value it in family as well." Lincoln turned slowly to face the entire room. Joseph Morgan just spoke eloquently about integrity. He spoke about the best of the Morgan family, but he left out a very important member. Lincoln put a strong, fatherly hand on my shoulder. "This is Joshua, my biological son, the son Joseph and Sarah were paid to hide, and the son I was told was dead." Gasps rippled violently through the crowd. Whispers erupted. Matthew looked utterly confused, staring at Joseph. Sarah, who had just emerged from the hallway, was frozen in her tracks, looking like she was about to faint. "But that's not the worst part," Lincoln continued, his voice turning to cold, unforgiving steel. He opened the folder and dropped a thick stack of certified bank statements, forged medical documents, and trust fund ledgers right onto Arthur's plate. "Arthur, look at these. The extravagant wedding you are sitting at tonight? Joseph and Sarah didn't pay for it. They funded it by systematically embezzling millions of dollars from a trust fund set up for Joshua by his late grandfather. They forged his signature. They claimed he was mentally unfit. They stole his entire inheritance to buy Matthew a luxury Porsche, pay his private tuition, and fund this very wedding. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The silence in the grand hall was absolute, deafening. You could hear a pin drop. The only sound was the rustling of paper as Arthur hastily flipped through the documents, his face turning an angry, mottled purple. Then Sarah snapped. Her pristine facade shattered completely. She rushed forward, her chair crashing backward to the floor. "He's lying!" she screamed hysterically, her voice shrill and desperate, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at me. "Joshua is a pathological liar. He's just jealous. He's always been intensely jealous of Matthew. He forged those papers to ruin us." I looked at her. After 28 years of seeking her approval, of fearing her wrath, I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no anger, just a cold, clinical pity for a pathetic creature. "The papers are certified by the bank and the state courts, Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly calm and loud enough for everyone to hear over her screaming. "And the lawyer standing at the back of the room with the police is holding the active warrants for your arrest." I gestured to the main entrance. Luke, the lawyer, was standing there with 2 uniformed police officers, their radios crackling softly. Sarah let out a guttural scream, a horrifying sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. She tried to lunge across the table at me, her hands reaching like claws, but Joseph grabbed her arm, pulling her back forcefully. He looked utterly defeated, staring blankly at the floor, knowing the game was over. The next 30 minutes were pure, unadulterated chaos, but it was the most beautiful chaos I had ever witnessed in my life. Arthur stood up, his face red with a terrifying fury. He looked at the documents on his plate, then glared at Joseph with pure disgust. "Is this true?" Arthur bellowed, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Did you steal from your own son to pay for this farce of a wedding?" Joseph opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but no words came out. He just nodded, a pathetic, small, cowardly gesture. Arthur slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He turned to his daughter, Chloe, who was crying hysterically in her designer wedding dress, her makeup running down her face. "Chloe, we are leaving. Right now." "Dad, no." Chloe sobbed, clinging to Matthew's arm. "We just got married. I love him. I will arrange the annulment first thing tomorrow morning," Arthur declared, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. "My daughter is not marrying into a family of felons and thieves. And Joseph, my lawyer will be contacting you for a full, immediate reimbursement of every single penny I contributed to this wedding." Guests were whispering furiously, grabbing their coats, and heading rapidly for the exits, wanting no part in the scandal. The grand, expensive wedding had dissolved into a humiliating crime scene in less than 10 minutes. The police officers approached the head table. They didn't put Sarah and Joseph in handcuffs right then and there. It was a white-collar financial crime investigation, not a violent assault. But they formally, loudly asked them to step outside for questioning regarding the fraudulent documents Luke had filed with the district attorney earlier that morning. Joseph looked at me as he walked past, his shoulders slumped. "Joshua, please, be reasonable. We're your parents." "No, you're not," I replied, not breaking eye contact, my voice steady. "You were just my wardens, and now you're going to pay for it." Lincoln patted my back proudly. "Come on, son. We're done here." We walked out of the venue, leaving the shattered, ruined remains of the Morgan family behind us. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in 28 years, I took a deep, unrestricted, truly free breath. We were walking toward Lincoln's luxury SUV in the gravel parking lot when I heard someone running heavily behind us. "Joshua, wait, please." I turned around. It was Matthew. His expensive tuxedo jacket was off. His bow tie was undone and hanging loosely around his neck, and he looked like a complete, utter wreck. His face was red, streaked with tears, his perfect hair disheveled. I tensed up immediately, bracing myself, expecting him to throw a punch or scream at me for ruining his life and his marriage. Lincoln stepped slightly in front of me, highly protective, ready to intercept him. But Matthew didn't raise his fists. He stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily, looking at me with absolute, crushing devastation. "Joshua, I swear to God," Matthew choked out, his voice cracking painfully. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the money or the trust." I stared at him, the golden child, the one who got the Porsche, the praise, the private college, the endless financial support. "You really expect me to believe you didn't question how Dad afforded a brand new Porsche on a middle management salary?" I asked coldly, my skepticism heavy. Matthew shook his head frantically, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "They told me Grandpa Howard left a small, private fund just for me because I was his favorite. They told me you were terrible with money, that you were irresponsible, and that Grandpa dropped you out of his will. I believed them, Joshua. I was stupid and I was horribly arrogant, but I never, ever would have taken your money if I knew it was yours. I swear it on my life." I looked deeply into his eyes. For years, I had hated him with a burning passion. But right now, looking at my younger brother crying in a parking lot, I saw exactly what he was. Another victim of Sarah and Joseph. They had poisoned him with toxic entitlement, built his entire life on a fragile foundation of lies, and set him up for a spectacular, humiliating fall. He had just lost his wife, his family's reputation, his financial security, and his entire reality in the span of an hour. I let out a long, slow breath. I felt the decades of anger toward him evaporate into the cool night air, leaving only a dull, profound sadness. "I believe you, Matthew," I said softly. He broke down completely, dropping to his knees on the sharp gravel, sobbing violently into his hands. "I'm so sorry, Josh. I'm so sorry for everything." I walked over and put a gentle hand on his shaking shoulder. I didn't pull him up. I couldn't fix his shattered life for him, but I wasn't going to kick him while he was down. "You have a lot to figure out," I told him, my voice not unkind. "When you do, you know my number." I turned and got into Lincoln's car. As we drove away from the vineyard, I looked out the window at the passing city lights. The storm was finally over. Now it was time to rebuild. 6 months had passed since the catastrophic implosion at the Willow Creek Vineyard. Half a year since the carefully constructed, fraudulent world of Joseph and Sarah Morgan shattered into a million unfixable pieces on the marble floor of that reception hall. The immediate aftermath of the wedding was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial audits, and harsh realities. I spent countless hours sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Lincoln's corporate headquarters, going over mountains of paperwork with Luke, the brilliant lawyer who had spearheaded the investigation. Luke was relentless. He took the embezzlement of my inheritance as a personal affront to justice, and he left absolutely no stone unturned. The criminal justice system moves slowly, but when it moves against you with undeniable, documented proof of massive financial fraud, it hits like a freight train. Sarah and Joseph didn't stand a chance. The district attorney looked at the forged medical documents, the falsified signatures, and the meticulous records of how they drained my grandfather's trust, and he threw the book at them. Because they were first-time offenders in their 60s, and because Lincoln and I agreed not to push for maximum prison sentences if they fully cooperated with financial restitution, they narrowly avoided spending the rest of their retirement in a federal penitentiary. Instead, they were handed heavy, restrictive probation and court-ordered restitution that essentially wiped out everything they had ever built. They were forced to sell the sprawling, 4-bedroom suburban house I had grown up in. The house where I was always sent to my cramped room while Matthew was celebrated in the grand living room. The state seized their savings accounts, their retirement funds, and their assets to pay back the stolen money. The total amount recovered was only a fraction of what my grandfather had originally placed in that college fund for me, but it was enough to completely bankrupt them. The social and professional fallout was even more devastating than the financial ruin. Joseph was a mid-level manager at a prestigious regional accounting firm. When the news of his indictment for forging financial documents and embezzling a trust fund broke, his firm didn't just fire him. They publicly distanced themselves, severing his pension and blacklisting him from the industry. He went from a respected, arrogant executive to a disgraced, unemployable man overnight. Sarah's downfall was entirely social, which, for a narcissist obsessed with appearances, was a fate worse than prison. Her country club membership was revoked. The wealthy friends she had spent decades trying to impress suddenly stopped returning her calls. When they were forced to move out of their beautiful neighborhood and into a tiny, run-down rental apartment on the outskirts of the city, the isolation broke her. I sat in the courtroom on the day the judge finalized the restitution order. I watched Joseph and Sarah sitting at the defense table. They looked 10 years older. Joseph's shoulders were slumped, his expensive suits replaced by an ill-fitting, cheap jacket. Sarah stared blankly at the polished wooden table, her perfect hair unkempt, the arrogant fire completely extinguished from her eyes. When the gavel fell, I didn't feel a rush of triumphant joy. I didn't cheer or gloat. I just felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The people who had kept me in the dark, who had emotionally starved me while stealing my future, were finally powerless. They could never hurt me again. They could never manipulate me again. I stood up from the wooden bench, adjusted my coat, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I was leaving the Morgans behind forever. The first thing I did when the legal dust settled was march into the county courthouse and legally change my name. Standing at the clerk's counter, signing the official decree, felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin I had been forced to wear for 28 years. I was no longer Joshua Morgan, the unwanted outcast. I was Joshua Reed. With a portion of the recovered inheritance, I was finally able to establish the foundation of the life my grandfather Howard had actually intended for me. I moved out of the cramped, drafty apartment with the rattling heater and the water-stained ceilings. I bought a beautiful, open-concept loft in a revitalized historic district of the city. It had exposed brick walls, massive floor-to-ceiling windows that let in rivers of natural light, and enough space for a professional graphic design studio right in my own home. The day I moved in was one of the best days of my life. I didn't have to hire a moving company. Julian, my older half-brother, pulled up in a rented box truck, wearing a faded t-shirt and a massive grin. He spent 8 hours carrying heavy furniture up the stairs, sweating and cracking terrible jokes, treating me like we had grown up in the same house our entire lives. Lincoln arrived later in the afternoon with his sleeves rolled up, carrying boxes of kitchen supplies. Carolyn, my incredible stepmother, showed up with a car full of housewarming gifts, fresh groceries, and a beautiful potted olive tree for the living room window. We ordered a mountain of pizzas, sat on the floor among the half-unpacked boxes, and drank cold beers. As I looked around at the three of them laughing and sharing stories, the profound realization hit me again. This was family. Not the people who shared a fake name on a piece of paper, but the people who showed up, who carried your heavy boxes, and who looked at you with genuine, uncomplicated love. My professional life transformed just as radically. Lincoln, being a powerhouse in the commercial real estate and corporate world, offered to make introductions for me. He wanted to buy me my own design agency, to hand me the world on a silver platter to make up for the lost years. But I politely refused. The Morgans had tried to dictate my worth with money, and I wanted to prove to myself that I had actual talent, separate from the Reed billions. I asked Lincoln only for an introduction to a few creative directors he respected. He set up the meetings, but the portfolio I brought was entirely my own. I landed a senior designer position at one of the top advertising agencies in the city. I negotiated my own salary, a figure that finally reflected my actual worth and allowed me to live comfortably without touching the rest of my grandfather's trust. I threw myself into the work with a passion I had never felt before. Without the crushing weight of my fake family's constant criticism dragging me down, my creativity exploded. I led campaigns for major national brands. I worked late nights not out of desperation to pay rent, but out of genuine love for the craft. Within 5 months of joining the firm, my creative director pulled me into his office and offered me a massive promotion to art director, complete with my own team of designers. I called Lincoln the moment I walked out of that office. When I told him about the promotion, the sheer, unfiltered pride in his voice made me pull my car over to the side of the road because my eyes were too blurry with tears to drive. "I knew you would do it, Joshua," Lincoln said over the phone. "You didn't need my money. You just needed a fair fight. I am so incredibly proud of the man you are." For 28 years, I had desperately craved validation from Joseph, a man who viewed me as a financial transaction. Hearing it from the man whose blood actually ran through my veins, a man I deeply respected, healed a wound I thought would bleed forever. Amidst all the rebuilding and the joy, there was one unresolved thread from my past that still tugged at my conscience. Matthew. We hadn't spoken since that chaotic night in the gravel parking lot of the vineyard. I knew from the legal proceedings that he wasn't involved in the embezzlement, but the gap between us was still a vast ocean of resentment and vastly different childhoods. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unsaved number. "Hey Josh, it's Matthew. I know you don't owe me anything, but if you have a half hour, I'd really like to buy you a cup of coffee." No pressure. I stared at the screen for a long time. The old Joshua would have ignored it, protecting himself from further pain. But the new Joshua, Joshua Reed, had the emotional bandwidth to face the past without fear. I sent him the address of a quiet, independent coffee shop near my new office and told him to meet me at noon. When I walked into the shop, I almost didn't recognize him. The golden child of the Morgan family was gone. Matthew was sitting in a corner booth, staring into a black mug of coffee. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive, custom-tailored real estate suits. He was wearing a plain gray sweater, worn-out jeans, and a jacket that looked like it came from a discount rack. The arrogant, untouchable aura he used to carry was completely stripped away. He looked exhausted. He looked real. I slid into the booth across from him. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my tailored coat and the calm confidence I now carried. "Thanks for coming," Matthew said, his voice quiet, lacking its usual booming bravado. "I honestly didn't think you would. I figured we were overdue for a real conversation," I replied, signaling the barista for a black coffee. "How have you been, Matthew?" "Truly." He let out a hollow, self-deprecating laugh. "Honestly, it's been hell. But an educational kind of hell." He ran a hand through his hair. "The divorce was finalized last month. Or rather, the annulment. Chloe's dad, Arthur, deployed an army of corporate lawyers. They completely destroyed me. Chloe wouldn't even speak to me directly. She just blocked my number and let her family handle the garbage disposal. I felt a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry. That's a brutal way to end a relationship." "It was a brutal relationship to begin with. I just couldn't see it," Matthew admitted, looking down at his hands. "Arthur made sure I was fired from the real estate brokerage. Nobody in the luxury market will touch me with a 10-foot pole now. My reputation is toxic by association." "What are you doing for work?" I asked. "I'm selling mid-range commercial insurance over the phone," he said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "It's a tiny cubicle. The pay is mostly commission. I had to sell the Porsche to pay off the massive legal fees from the divorce and to afford the deposit on a tiny studio apartment." I studied his face. He was waiting for me to gloat. He was waiting for me to tell him he deserved it, that karma had finally collected its debt. But looking at my younger brother, stripped of all his unearned privilege, I just saw a young man finally stepping into the real world. "It sounds like you're actually working for a living for the first time in your life," I said, my tone completely neutral. Matthew nodded slowly. "I am. And Josh, I wanted to look you in the eye and tell you something. Losing the money, losing the status, losing Chloe, it all hurt. But the thing that kept me awake every single night was realizing what Mom and Dad did to you. To fund my life." His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "I was so blind. I was so wrapped up in being the favorite that I never stopped to ask why you were always treated like an afterthought. I took the cars, the tuition, the vacations, and I never once advocated for you. I am deeply, profoundly sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix 28 years of neglect, but I needed you to hear it." I leaned back against the leather booth. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. The toxic umbilical cord to our parents had been severed, and without their constant manipulation whispering in his ear, Matthew was finally developing a conscience. "I appreciate that, Matthew. More than you know," I said softly. "I don't blame you for their crimes. You were a child when they started this lie, and they manipulated you just as much as they manipulated me. They just used a different tactic. They starved me, but they poisoned you with entitlement." Matthew wiped a tear from his cheek. "Have you spoken to them?" "No," I said firmly, "and I never will. They are dead to me." "Me neither," Matthew whispered. "Mom called me 100 times from her new apartment, begging me to come over, blaming you for destroying the family. I finally changed my number. I can't be around them anymore. Every time I look at them, all I see is the money they stole from you." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee. The tension that had defined our entire relationship was entirely gone. "You know," I said, looking out the rain-streaked window, "I have a new apartment, a loft downtown. I have a guest room." Matthew looked up, surprised. "I'm not saying we are instantly best friends," I continued, meeting his gaze. "We have a lot of history to unpack. But if you ever want to come over, watch a football game, and drink a beer that you actually paid for yourself, the door is open." A massive, genuine smile broke across Matthew's face, reaching all the way to his eyes. "I'd like that, Josh. I'd really like that." Thanksgiving had always been my least favorite holiday. In the Morgan household, it was a stressful, theatrical production designed solely for Sarah to show off her pristine dining room to extended family. I was usually relegated to the kitchen, washing pots and pans while Joseph held court in the living room, bragging loudly about Matthew's latest fabricated achievements. It was a day of walking on eggshells, biting my tongue, and feeling the acute, stabbing pain of loneliness in a crowded room. This year, however, was different. This year I was hosting. The sprawling kitchen of my new loft smelled incredible. I had been up since dawn, roasting a massive turkey, preparing homemade stuffing, and baking pies from scratch. But the best part wasn't the food. The best part was the noise filling my apartment. It wasn't the tense, performative chatter of the past. It was loud, chaotic, genuine laughter. The doorbell rang, and I wiped my hands on an apron before pulling the heavy wooden door open. Lincoln and Carolyn stood in the hallway, their arms full of wine bottles and covered dishes. Lincoln pulled me into a fierce embrace, kissing the side of my head like a father who had loved me since the day I was born. Julian arrived 10 minutes later with Dylan, my best friend. The two of them had hit it off famously, bonding over their mutual love of obscure video games and terrible craft beer. They immediately took over the living room, arguing playfully over the football game playing on the large flat-screen TV. And then, just as I was taking the turkey out of the oven to rest, there was a quiet knock at the door. I opened it to find Matthew standing there. He was holding a remarkably ugly, store-bought pumpkin pie and looking incredibly nervous. "Hey," he said, shifting his weight. "I know I'm a little early. I can come back if you're still setting up." "Get in here, idiot," I laughed, grabbing the pie and pulling him into the apartment. Julian walked over, holding 2 cold beers. He handed one to Matthew without missing a beat. "You must be the little brother. I'm the older, significantly better-looking brother. I hear you're in insurance now. Let's talk premiums." I watched as Matthew, initially stiff and apprehensive, slowly relaxed as Julian and Dylan pulled him into their orbit. There was no judgment here. There was no hierarchy. Nobody was competing for scraps of affection. When it was time to eat, we all gathered around the massive, rustic oak dining table I had bought specifically for this space. Lincoln sat at one end, Carolyn at the other. Julian, Dylan, and Matthew lined the sides. I stood at the head of the table, holding a glass of wine, looking at the glowing faces of the people in my home. The clinking of silverware and the overlapping conversations slowly died down as they realized I was standing to give a toast. I looked at Lincoln, whose eyes were already shining with unshed tears. I looked at Carolyn, whose warm, maternal smile anchored the room. I looked at Dylan, who had been my only family during the darkest years. And I looked at Matthew, my brother, who had lost everything only to find his actual soul. "I used to hate this holiday," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "I used to sit at a different table, surrounded by people who shared my last name, and feel completely, utterly alone. I thought that was just what family was. I thought it was an obligation you simply endured." I took a deep breath, fighting the knot in my throat. 6 months ago, a very dark, very painful truth came into the light. The day of that wedding felt like a catastrophe. But looking back, I realize now that it wasn't a tragedy. It was a funeral. It was the funeral of a toxic, fraudulent life that was slowly killing me. And from the ashes of that funeral, I finally won full custody of my own future. I won custody of my own identity. I raised my glass higher. Family is not just the blood in your veins. And it is certainly not a financial transaction or a secret arrangement. Family are the people who look at you when you are broken, and instead of walking away, they sit down in the dirt with you and help you put the pieces back together. Family are the people sitting at this table right now. I am Joshua Reed. I am loved. And for the first time in my entire life, I am truly, deeply thankful. Here, Lincoln choked out, raising his glass, tears freely falling down his weathered cheeks. "To family," Julian echoed, clinking his glass against Matthew's. We drank, we ate, and we laughed until our ribs ached. The food was incredible, But the company was a miracle. As the evening wound down and the city lights twinkled through the massive loft windows, I stood in my kitchen, washing a coffee mug. It was the exact same action I had been doing 6 months ago when Sarah called to ban me from the wedding. But everything else had changed. The crushing weight on my chest was gone. The hollow ache in my stomach was filled. I was no longer the unwanted ghost. I was the master of my own house, surrounded by the people who chose me. Sitting here now, sharing this journey with all of you, I realize how incredibly universal this pain can be. So many of us walk around carrying the heavy, suffocating baggage of the families we were born into. We twist ourselves into knots, sacrificing our own happiness, our own dignity, and sometimes our own sanity, just trying to earn a drop of affection from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. If there is one profound, unshakable lesson I want you to take away from my story, it is this. You cannot control the family you were born into, but you have absolute, unyielding power over the family you choose to keep. Do not let toxic people, even if they hold the title of mother or father, convince you that their brokenness is a reflection of your worth. True love does not require you to diminish yourself. True family does not demand your silence or your suffering in exchange for their presence. Sometimes, walking away from the people who share your DNA is the most powerful, necessary act of self-love you will ever perform. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how much it disrupts the comfortable lies people tell themselves, is always the only foundation worth building a life upon. I had to face the terrifying reality of my origins, the betrayal of my inheritance, and the absolute destruction of the only family dynamic I knew. But burning down that house of lies was the only way I could clear the ground to build a mansion of truth. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be valued for exactly who you are, not for what you can provide or what secrets you can keep. Never, ever settle for a seat in the corner of a room where you are not celebrated. Thank you so much for staying with me, for listening to my story, and for being a part of this amazing community. I would love to hear from you. What is the biggest lesson you've learned about dealing with toxic family members or setting hard boundaries in your own life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Or, if this story simply resonated with you and you value the lessons shared today, just drop the word "good" in the comments so I know we are standing together. Stay strong, trust your intuition, and never stop fighting for the life and the family you truly deserve.